I'll put the link up on in the chat. We've been recording most of the lunchtime seminars, so we will put it there. Maybe we'll even have a special blog post we could add with more description. But like I mentioned earlier, I'm Paul McPherron. I'm the faculty director of ASSERT and an English professor at Hunter. And I'm really excited for today's talk. I'm going to let Jeff Allred introduce Katina Rogers, who has graciously come to talk to us about her great book, Putting the Humanities PhD to Work. We're going to do a Q&A style. So Jeff's going to kind of start it with some questions, and then around 12:30 or so, we can open it up to the group. We can either, if you have a question, you can put it in the chat in the first half hour, if that's okay with Katina, and then I can kind of monitor it, but we'll open it up to questions more widely. We'll try to just call on everybody. So take it away. Thanks, Jeff.
Okay, terrific. Thank you, Paul. I'll just introduce myself super quickly. I'm Paul's colleague in the English department, long-time kind of active member of ASSERT and former director of ASSERT. And I'm really excited about this event. Thank you so much, Katina, for coming and gracing us with your presence. I'm really excited to talk about you and your work. I've known Katina since she came to an ASSERT event several years ago in connection with the Futures Initiative, and have kind of been tracking what she's been up to on some level since then, and was really excited to learn about this book and to dig into it myself, and to have the chance to bring her to campus, or what passes for campus at this point. So more formally, Katina Rogers is co-director of the Futures Initiative at the Graduate Center at CUNY, where she guides and mentors graduate students, develops programming, and exercises administrative oversight over all aspects of the program. She is also director of programs and administration for Haystack, the online scholarly network. That's an acronym, HASTAC, and co-director of the CUNY Humanities Alliance, a partnership between the Graduate Center and 4 CUNY community colleges supported by the Mellon Foundation. Rogers researches and writes about higher education reform, including scholarly communication practices, professionalization and career development, public scholarship, and advocacy for fair labor policies. She is author of our topic for today, Putting the Humanities PhD to Work, Thriving in and Beyond the Classroom, which is out with Duke University Press in this year, 2020. Rogers holds a PhD in comparative literature from the University of Colorado at Boulder. And I'll just say that if you want more detail about Katina's fascinating life journey, read her book, because she gives a wonderful overview of her journey kind of through graduate school and into academia, and uses it as the most compelling, in many ways, case study for what it means to put the PhD to work. So my job is to ask a few questions and then let Katina be Katina and answer, answer, and then we'll all have a chance, as Paul said, to have a Q&A at the end. So I want to start with a kind of writerly question. Seeing this book and seeing this book come out with a really prominent academic press, I wasn't quite sure what to expect, but it really struck me immediately on reading it, as I've already mentioned, that the book features a compelling mix of styles and modes of address. Reading it, I hear elements of memoir as a genre, the self-help or advice genre, cultural theory, sociology, and kind of more policy-oriented or advocacy work. I note that you shift also registers throughout the book, from first person sharing of individual experiences to second person kind of mentoring voice to third person objective analysis. So my first question is just, what was it like to write this book, which practices what it preaches in terms of departing from the sort of monography voice that we usually use in academic work, and kind of branch out into this set of experiments, rhetorical experiments, among many other things.
Thank you. And Jeff and Paul, thank you so much for having me. I'm really glad to be here and to have a chance to talk with you all today. I'm really glad to get a question about the writing, because that's something that I haven't had a chance to actually talk much about in some of the other talks that I've given. And I think for me, I guess a couple of things. One thing is that mix that you're describing really echoes the kind of blended nature of my work. I mean, I'm in an administrative position. I do a lot of different things over the course of the day, as I'm sure everybody at CUNY is wearing a million hats tends to do. But that shifting between kind of a research mode and a more mentorship mode is something that really maps onto the way that I see and understand my role. And so in some ways that felt quite natural, actually, to work between those different registers and those different structures. It did make it challenging to create a coherent sense of a through line. There were so many different things that I wanted to talk about. And some things are really, more clearly addressed to faculty. Some are much more pertinent to grad students. And it was a little bit challenging to find exactly how to do that without it being too jarring to move from one to the other. But I think that one thing that's been nice, maybe in a way, I mean, this is the first piece of published scholarship that I've been able to produce in a long time. I finished my PhD in 2010, and I've been in administrative roles since then. And so I think that it's given me some distance from a scholarly mode of writing in the way that I was trained. And I've been doing much more, grant writing and pitching op-eds, usually unsuccessfully, but still, trying and writing in these different, for these different publics and in different registers. And I think that that has really helped the readability of my work. At least I hope it has. I hope the book is really readable. And for me, the reflection of my own story and thinking about how to talk about that in a way that's relevant and connected to the research and the advocacy that I want to do has been a really significant exercise for me. And I think a good way of working with the grad students in the program as well, to have that as, an example, and not, I don't know, not that everybody's path looks the same. In fact, quite the opposite, but it's been a good way to show some of those twists and turns, I think.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Katina. I'm sure others will have follow-up questions later in the Q&A about the writing process. I certainly would affirm the idea that it's readable. It's a wonderfully kind of charming, engaging voice that you create throughout. Second question, I admire the frank utopianism of this book and want to think a little more about one of its more utopian aspects, along with Fred Moten and Stefano Harney, who you mentioned in several times in the book. Christopher Newfield, I also think of, and other people thinking about kind of the structure of higher ed and the politics of higher ed. I hear you giving a robust defense of the undergraduate and graduate education as a public good, one that should be distributed widely in high quality form. Whereas as things stand, higher education is increasingly thought of by legislators and ordinary sort of lay people as a private good, something that one buys to invest in oneself, often in very strictly economic terms. Could you talk about some examples of how scholarship particularly would look different in a university system that reorients itself and conceives of itself as a truly public good?
Yeah, what a great question. It's so interesting to me at this moment where I feel very deeply cynical to remember that it is a very hopeful book and that I wrote it from a place of hopefulness. And I've been trying to hold on to that hopefulness almost as a discipline, because I think right now it's not easy to feel very rosy about the state of public higher education in the US. I think that I don't know if everybody here is affiliated with CUNY, but I know, having been here through the spring, having seen what our students have gone through, both at the graduate and the undergraduate level, having seen the things that faculty members and staff members were balancing, knowing all of the pushes and pulls that are coming from the mayor and the governor, and how CUNY gets sort of tossed around in the mix like that. For me, the importance of public education has never felt more urgent and more immediate. I mean, I think, especially when I think back to March, when the pandemic was unfolding so rapidly in New York and so little was understood about it. And yet we were seeing immediate patterns that mapped onto poverty and income distribution and race and ethnicity across the city. And you have people wondering why, are some people more susceptible to the virus than others? And I think that what I felt at that moment was that we needed people who understood the history, the sociology, the reasons why there were these, these patterns that made it so much harder for some people to stay home from work, people who had to be in on the front lines, or people who lost their jobs immediately and who didn't have access to healthcare. I mean, I think that question of humanistic and social science oriented education, not as an instrument to self-betterment, but to a better understanding of how we all function collectively and why certain things happen in the way that they do. I mean, it just, it feels so completely essential to me at this moment. I think that we've been really needing people, both to, on the topic of the pandemic, and then also the election still feels both recent and very distant, I think, in some ways, and seeing all of the rhetoric around media interpretation and voter disenfranchisement and how all of these pieces are connected. I mean, I think that that is really where humanistic thinking can bring a lot of value, to being able to look at things from different sides, to hold something up to the light and really consider how something came to be and what the implications are. I think that, it's one of my goals in writing the book. I find that a lot of books that deal with career questions can start to sound a little bit neoliberal sometimes. I mean, I think that they can be easily used, I should say, for aims within universities to have more of a sense of like workforce readiness, that we need to put people into jobs and we justify our existence through the pathways that people take. And that was very much not what I was wanting to do. I think that when we talk about career pathways and when we talk about all of the places that people can apply what they've gained through the course of their education, that is, to me, something that is needed not only by the individual, but that's really necessary to society. It is a little utopian, I guess.
Thanks, Katina. That's not a bad word for me at all. Yeah, it's one thing that attracts me to the book. If I could follow up on that question a little bit, one thing that I was really struck by as a faculty member and as someone who strives at least to be active, in publishing work, it really struck me, or something that I've often observed, just kind of without thinking about it too hard, really became an object of contemplation in reading your work, which is, however much we all claim that we hate capitalism and we all sort of resist, neoliberalism and whatnot, in our actual behavior, if you really stand back and look at it sociologically, we relentlessly, if we're playing the game and if we're being successful according to the dominant model, it's something you point out at many points in the book, we relentlessly accumulate our own cultural capital, right? We work on our own scholarship. That's the most important thing. We try to downplay service and teaching. We downplay also collaborations where the money doesn't kind of end up in our own pocket. If we're playing the game, if we're optimizing our status in the game, and few of us really resist that fully. One of the valuable things about the undercommons concept is that it really calls attention to, in a differently utopian way, all the people and spaces that are kind of existing outside and underneath that economy. So I just want to say, I want you to share maybe a couple of examples that you use in your book of how the kind of praxis of what we do as scholars might change if we say no to this model, if we say no to the idea that we should just try to accumulate more cultural capital for ourselves and see ourselves as civil servants whose work doesn't need to just accumulate prestige for ourselves or the institution, but can do other things.
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to do on an individual level because the reality is that those markers of prestige really matter, for being able to, to be able to have a platform, to be able to advance in one's career. I mean, I think that the structure of the game is such that by accumulating some of those markers, then people feel they can gain the freedom to do other things. But I think that, again, like one of the reasons that I wanted to address both individual and institutional factors in the book is that I think that when there's a collective movement in a particular direction, it can create some new possibilities. And I certainly see this at CUNY. I mean, I think the emphasis on collaborative work, or at least the efforts to get there, even when sometimes it's really difficult across structures, is something that is that I haven't seen at many other institutions, not at this level. I think that, there are ways that this sort of refusal can happen both through teaching and also through research. I think that different people are able to take different levels of risk, and I want to really acknowledge that you know, the academy is known to be a place where race and gender are subject to just as much inequality and bias as in other workplaces, sometimes more. And so in some cases, it doesn't feel safe to take a risk. But I think that in terms of teaching, you know, I see this a lot in graduate seminars. There's sort of ways that things are commonly done, but I think a lot of undergraduate classrooms sometimes take much more creative approaches. And I think that, you know, having students think from an applied perspective from the outset of a course is a really relatively simple, relatively inexpensive, and fairly doable at an individual level, a way to think differently about the nature and role of scholarship and how we are a part of a broader landscape. So I think having grad students write and pitch op-eds, for instance, is a great way to have people thinking about, you know, what does it mean to write about something in a way that is not dumbed down, not simplistic, but that communicates meaning and complexity in a nuanced way that is still readable. And I think that in some ways, that act of writing for different audiences is really similar to the practice of teaching, but they're not often talked about in conjunction with one another. This effort to bring people along and to bring people to a certain point of understanding. We don't think about teaching as dumbing something down or as oversimplifying something. We see that as a craft and a practice. So I think that including assignments that are really you know, oriented towards a different public than traditional academic assignments might be. I think that doing research that is connected to the communities that we have commitments to inside and outside the academy, and having those motivations and commitments really drive us and be a visible and forward presence in what we're talking about. I mean, I think a lot of what I talk about in the book comes down to a more holistic understanding of scholars as people, students as people, all of the varied relationships and connections that we have with one another and with the world around us. And I think that when we start to see that more capaciously and allow those relationships to be a part of what we're doing, then it becomes more natural and more organic to work across different registers, to work across different modes. I hope so anyway. But I mean, I see this all the time at CUNY, the kinds of public history projects and public-oriented work that people are doing, experiential learning. I mean, it's incredible. CUNY is such a great example.
Thank you. Thank you. And it's interesting to think about how the book would be different if you had not spent, you know, so much of your professional life at CUNY, which is such a distinctive place in these ways, I think. Well, on a related note, I wanted to ask a third question. In higher education, to me, according to my perception, and this is partly, you know, this kind of good old like CUNY resentment of our social betters. But I think in higher ed, the lower you get on the scale of endowments and prestige, the more you feel, even as an individual faculty member, a staff member, the pressure of instrumentalizing what we do, of being asked to be quote unquote entrepreneurial, sometimes literally, to try to find sources of money. And of conceiving of undergraduate education primarily as workforce development rather than the cultivation of citizenship or other kind of more traditional ideas of liberal education. We faculty, and I can certainly say this for the English department, instinctually kind of bitch and moan about this emphasis, often in a very haughty kind of way, you know, sort of scoffing at neoliberalism, going off on rants, ending up sounding a bit like Matthew Arnold sometimes, quite conservatively, as if, you know, we can't sully our hands with, you know, the sort of practical stuff that we're up in the sort of ether thinking about higher things. Reading your work, I see a really fresh take on this development that is thinking of ways to bend these neoliberal themes into more radically democratic shapes. So I wonder how you think we should think about this rising institutional emphasis on career readiness in our role at Hunter, particularly.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the focus on career readiness itself is not necessarily the problem, but the way that it's talked about is, and the way that it's understood. I think it's generally thought about and approached in a really reductive manner. that creates this and strengthens this dichotomy between like the life of the mind and a more like capitalist approach. But I think the reality is that like people they need a paycheck, they need health insurance. I think that minimizing that is actually really damaging, and we see that in academic professions as well. I think this is part of the way that people end up in really exploitative adjunct positions for long stretches of time, is that there's this sense of a higher calling in academia that tries to deny the reality of the world that we're living in and how to navigate that world and how to care for the people that we care for and do all the things that are a part of our lives. And so again, I think that a more holistic approach to understanding like the fact that jobs are important and that we need them. And then thinking about like how that connects with what our values are and what we care about and what we're trying to teach within the humanities in particular from my point of view. I think the CUNY Humanities Alliance is a good model to look at for this. The fact that it's been connecting the Graduate Center specifically with community colleges has been very interesting for me, because community colleges tend to have so much pressure on them towards a sort of transactional view of education, the idea that there needs to be a vocational match to what students are learning, that they're immediately set up on when they finish there. But what we've been finding and emphasizing through the Humanities Alliance is that students, especially CUNY students, but I'm sure this is true in different ways in other community college contexts, CUNY students are navigating so much cultural complexity all the time, and to provide a space and container for thinking about and understanding and contextualizing that gives students so much insight into, their unique perspectives, their strengths in a wide range of contexts. And so that's where I think, focusing on a one-to-one match of this skill tracks to this job and then you're ready to get a job is a narrow view both of education and of careers. But I think that having an openness to the fact of career readiness within maybe a more traditional humanities educational context, I think that creates this possibility of kind of I tend to talk about like a translational approach instead of transferable skills, because I don't think that things can easily be picked up and put down from one place to another without going through a transformative process. But I think that thinking in terms of a lens that the education can provide in a range of careers, or a perspective and approach, something that enriches any path that students are on. I don't think that's again a little bit utopian. I think at the end of the day, students still do really need concrete support in finding and securing and being successful in jobs. And I think that professional development, it can happen through career services centers, but it also is really important for that to be part of an open conversation among departments, because I think students tend to, the voices of departments tend to be much more trusted. Maybe not more trusted, that might be an overstatement, but I think there's a sense that that if the department doesn't value those career opportunities and the pathways that a student is considering, that's where you start to see students being afraid to talk to their advisors about what their plans are and what they're interested in. And I think that's not what we want. I think a deeper connection between different areas of study and professional life seems much more enriching.
Thank you, Katina. I really appreciate that. And I know that, when you go to these meetings where career readiness is sort of the big topic, in the humanities, if you're in philosophy, if you're in English, if you're in art history, you hear before you even hear the slide deck, the giant sucking sound of resources and faculty lines going out of your zone and into econ and health sciences and other areas. And so I think your approach really allows us to, in a really full-throated way, explain how what we do is beneficial that way. So thank you. So I have one more question, and then we'll turn it over to the big group. At several points, you correctly note the deep conservatism of academic culture, which sometimes resembles, oh, Jesus. All right, sorry. That's my dog in my construction project. All right, there goes the dog. The construction project remains. I'm gonna see if I can just shout, okay? One more question and then I'll mute myself, I promise. I'm sorry, everyone. At several points, you correctly note the deep conservatism of academic culture, which to me sometimes resembles the guild system of medieval times, or the symbolically rich and genteelly vicious lives of courtiers in the Renaissance more than anything in the 21st century. I'm mostly sympathetic to the argument that we should replace the ivory tower model for academic work with the messier and more Whitmanic vision that you propose of a cultural commons woven deeply into other cultural institutions and groups. But I do worry that this conservatism, from tenure to departmentalization to peer review, can protect scholars and facilitate the creation of work that is extremely slow developing, perhaps unpopular, paradigm shifting, or just ahead of its times. Are there aspects of our institutional so-called conservatism that do conserve things worth conserving, especially in such an embattled time for education and educators of all stripes? I hope that came through. I'll mute.
The noise is not bad at all. I mean, I think that is certainly why those structures were set up, right? That's the goal, is to provide a set aside space where there is freedom to think through complicated ideas without the fear of losing your job because of it. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that in concept, that's incredibly important, not to have the fact of one's job security or salary or anything else tied to a particular research outcome. I think that's true in the humanities, it's true in the sciences as well. I think, you know, research that generates negative results is really important to advancing human knowledge. And you need some protection to be able to do that. Otherwise, everything has to be, have like a clear monetary value, which is not great. But I think that those structures are not working as intended, and they're protecting you know, people and spaces and concepts in ways that are not equal, and that I would say don't necessarily advance the overall goals and values of a public institution like CUNY. And this is where, like, an idea that I don't talk about much in the book, but that I've been thinking through lately is a tension between an institution's stated values and unstated values. So a place like CUNY, you know, we have very strong stated values in support of democratic educational access, in support of you know, diversity and equity on all kinds of axes, and yet a lot of our structures for promotion and advancement and you know, admissions at some of the schools match schools who have a very different set of goals, and one that is much more exclusive and restrictive in nature. And I think that one thing that happens then is that you try to do something new, you try to do something that that pushes closer towards one of the stated values, and you find yourself stuck. And I think, you know, there's probably lots of examples we could all think about at CUNY of programs like this, where something has been really good in theory, has funding and support behind it and everything, and just doesn't get traction. And I think that one of the reasons for that lack of traction is because of this difference between stated and unstated values. You're running into some unexamined values that are making it impossible to create the new kinds of structures that might be desirable. And so that's, I mean, I'm not sure, and I would love to hear your perspective or the perspective of others on this too, that like, tenure seems really important, you know? How can we retain the components of that are important without, you know, replicating the kinds of inequality that have long been a part of the academy and that don't match CUNY's values?
Thanks so much, Katina and Jeff. I'll just jump in to open it up to the group. I also mentioned what you just said, Katina, reminded me, we read in a small group a couple of years ago, Patricia Matthews, I think is her name, Written, Unwritten, and that some of those written, unwritten, like those unwritten rules really limit, especially faculty of color on their tenure path, because they might be aiming towards those goals of support for students, especially students from underprivileged backgrounds, but that's not really what's going to give them tenure. And that's some of the unwritten rules of promotion. So yeah, let's open it up. If anybody wants to, I don't know, either unmute or we can call on you. You can raise your hand or put it in the chat. And we have, oh yeah, another link to her book there. Does anybody want to jump in? I'm just looking through the gallery with a comment or a question for Katina. Yeah, go ahead, Ronnie.
Hi, I apologize because I'm very interested in the book, but have not read it and actually didn't know of it until we got the Assert info. So I look forward to reading it. I wonder if you could just tell us, and in case others are also unfamiliar with it, whether your main focus is on how we train PhD students and what we envision them doing or prepare them to do afterwards, or whether it's on teaching the humanities at the undergraduate level, both those things, other things. I think those are all important topics, and I kind of wondered what your particular focus is. And I ask that as someone who teaches at Hunter, but also at the grad center, advises students, and have had a student who was in the Futures program and ended up with a job that was part staff and part teaching, which is actually more what she wanted to be doing anyway. So I'd be happy to hear anything you have to say, and just add one word that I still find it kind of appalling, back to the conservative idea of academia, that so many academics think being an academic is the only thing that smart people do. And, I say that as someone who happens to be married to an academic, so much of my life is, involved in that. And I think it was when, we had a child and had conversations with the parents at daycare that I started meeting a whole circle of really smart, interesting people who, thank goodness, had nothing to do with academia. But, even comments like, when my son was, looking for his first job, and I mentioned to people what it was, and it was, I got reactions like, "Are you disappointed he's not going to become a professor?" And I just found this so totally absurd. So anyway, that's enough for me, but I'd be happy to hear any comments you have on your book, further details, or anything else.
It's kind of insulting, honestly. Anyway, I won't go, I agree. I won't go down that road too deeply, but yeah, if we apply the kind of curiosity that has, is really deeply a part of academia, and apply it to a broader set of societal pathways and career pathways, then the opportunities are much, much broader than I think a lot of people conceive of. The book is definitely geared towards graduate student preparation and the structures that are in that particular moment where, doctoral students are in this dual role, both as teachers and as learners, and this kind of moment where things could tip one way or the other, depending on how students are socialized, how they're, what is normalized for them in their departments, both, if they're teaching, then in the teaching context, but also in their departments where they're learning, and then in how that goes on to sort of replicate the next generation of higher ed. So I think that there are strong implications and things that can be applied in undergraduate contexts, but the focus is more at the graduate student level, both for students and for faculty and advisors.
And just a quick follow-up, do you find, forgetting COVID for a moment, which is hard to do, some of what you're talking about has been talked about for decades, literally. My PhD is from 1983, and I remember going to a session in grad school on non-academic careers, because I didn't know if I would get an academic job. And I wonder if you could tell us how you see this moment perhaps as different as we potentially rethink graduate education. Certainly the disappearance of tenure track jobs, shutting down of departments and things, is a key factor here, but there may be other things, that we haven't thought of in the current scene.
You're absolutely right that this has been talked about for decades. It gets frustrating sometimes. I'm still fairly junior in my career, but I even feel like, there have been so many conversations about career pathways and about the importance of education and how it can be applied in different contexts. And there are so many moments where it feels like people are hearing it for the first time, which is just, it continues to be kind of puzzling to me. I think that that to me tells me that there are strong cultural questions at play, that this is not a factor of just designing the right program. There's been so much money put into this by foundations, by institutions. Yeah. There have been so many good people working on this. There are great programs that have been developed. It's a question of, can we collectively think differently about what matters coming out of higher education, and step aside from the markers of prestige that have been the things that that we look to. So, moving away from institutional ratings and departmental ratings, thinking really critically about admissions processes and recruitment processes and who we're looking for in the students that are coming in. Tricia Matthews' book is one that I look to a lot in terms of faculty standards and norms and practices. And another person that I have really learned a lot from is Julie Passelt, whose book Inside Graduate Admissions really looks at that particular moment in the process. I mean, I think one thing that happens in these career conversations is they happen too late in people's trajectories. So they happen when people are close to finishing up and are starting to think about next steps and realize they need to broaden their horizons a little bit. And then it feels like a betrayal, the last few years that they've been working have all been moving them toward one particular thing. But it's not even just that, it's that the students who were selected into the department were selected often because they were likely to succeed in a particular understanding of success. And so shifting, how we see what we think successful scholarship looks like requires looking at all of those steps together and thinking, who are the students that we're, not only that we're maybe not supporting through their educational journeys, but who are we just missing because we're looking for the wrong thing in what we think, a graduate student looks like. So I think it's really a question of norms and culture, and that is the hardest thing to change. That's not your question though. You asked what is different about this moment, and I don't know. Definitely, the increasing reliance on adjuncts has been a crisis and is not getting better. And I think that puts some increased pressure and urgency on the conversation. I do think that COVID, I don't know quite how to articulate this, but I think that because so many things have been shaken up very quickly, there are some possibilities for rebuilding differently right now that we may not have had a year ago. It's hard to feel that way at CUNY, knowing everything that's going on with our budgets and the pressures that we're under in so many different ways. But I think that nationally there's an opportunity right now to think about the things that we thought could never happen. Nobody thought that we could go to all online education overnight, and we did. And if that's possible, what else? What are the things that we assume can't be changed that actually could be changed?
Great, thank you for a wonderful answer.
Jeff, thanks for your comment in the chat about, this idea of the overproduction of PhDs. This is one of the things that I really grapple with, is a sense that oh, and Jillian, I see your hand is raised too. Sorry. Anyway, I often hear that we need to have smaller PhD programs so that we don't have so many students competing for the same jobs. But I think that those are separate questions. I think that the question of how large a PhD program is should be tailored to how many students that program can support ethically. I think the questions of financial support, intellectual and social support, those are primary. And the question of faculty lines is a separate equation. I don't think they're linked. Should we turn to Jillian's question? Sorry, I didn't mean to hijack the Q&A.
Yeah, go ahead, Jillian.
No problem, Katina. And I think you were sort of already heading in the direction of where my question was going. So, thank you so much for sharing your work today. I really look forward to reading the book. I'm really happy that we're having this conversation. My husband is a PhD, and he has, he's an alt-ac person, and has been for the last 11 years, and he still gets questions about when is he really going to go back and become a professor. So this is like a never, so I say this because on the one hand, we know these are issues, but at the same time, it's really, we're dealing with sort of like really powerful, I think, ideologies within like the culture of academia. So, I really appreciate the conversation. I'm wondering, very specifically within CUNY and thinking about, the CUNY Graduate Center. I'm centrally housed at Hunter, but I do have an affiliation at the Graduate Center. So I do work with graduate students on occasion. And one of the big challenges there, from my perspective, is the crisis in funding, right, for the students. I've always felt like the CUNY graduate students, I don't even know how they finish, right? Like they finish under very different conditions than I did, right? And most of the folks that I know that are PhDs, in terms of, having to receive funding sources, like, some of them are teaching a course like at the College of Staten Island, 2 days a week, and then running back to teach at John Jay. And then also, they have a GA-ship at the Writing Center somewhere else. And so I bring that up because I'm wondering, what this kind of sort of hybrid model I think that you're proposing in terms of thinking about training graduate students. How do we think about that working within these like really kind of austere spaces, and especially the one that we're most familiar with here at CUNY?
It's really hard. And I think that the work of creating these new models really has to be paired with advocacy work at the city and state levels as well, and federal for that matter. Because we can't, there's a certain point at which we can't. And I think that there too, the fact of refusal can be important. I mean, I know PSC has been moving towards the possibility of strike mobilization. And I think that there's importance to that, we cannot just constantly do more and more and more with less. And this is where I think it's really important for there to be, these things will have to move in tandem, but the more that our research can have a public impact and be more visible in a public way, then it becomes easier to lobby in Albany and say, look, this is why CUNY education really matters. Look at the research we're producing, look at what we're able to do, and to really be able to talk about that, not only in the sciences, but also in the humanities and humanistic social sciences as well. But I absolutely think that advocacy is essential, because we can't do it at a certain point, yeah. And I don't know how the grad students do it. I don't know. It's really hard to see. It's all really deeply connected. And I think that I see Jeff's comment about having a hardworking community college faculty member in the White House. I'm really excited about that too. And also the fact that I think Biden is the first person to have graduated from a public institution. Is that right? And in a long time anyway. And Kamala Harris is the first person to graduate from an HBCU. And I think that really matters, having that representation at the federal level, hopefully can at least make it possible to talk about why education matters, which I think in the last 4 years, it's been hard to even get to that point. So yeah, I don't know what we do in the moment of austerity besides do the best we can and encourage our students to take care of their well-being. I think that, if we sacrifice our health and well-being for the work, that doesn't do anybody any good. And so finding ways to maintain that while also doing the advocacy work, I think is essential.
The question in the chat, Katina, from Anna.
Yeah. Anna, it's a good question. I think some of it depends on what kind of visibility you're thinking about and to what end. I definitely know many graduate students who are adjuncts who are really open with their students about the nature of their role, the nature of the way that they're paid. A lot of students just don't know that. I mean, I didn't know, even as a graduate student, I really didn't understand structures of academic labor. And so I think making that visible to students can be a powerful first step. I do think for adjuncts, the fact of refusal can be important, not taking on work that goes above and beyond. I think it's really hard at CUNY because people tend to care about their students very deeply, and nobody wants to be making a decision that harms students or that leads to students not getting the best education that they can. At the same time, you can't do everything, and you can't be the one to carry the burden of that austerity on your back. And so I think saying no to things that are uncompensated service work and making it clear that you're an adjunct, I think that's a good solid starting point that doesn't put too much extra work on you, because I think that's a concern as well.
Is it deepsikha? Yeah.
Yeah, deepsikha, but I go by Deeps also. Hi, Katina. I am a little bit of a strange person. I am a full-time faculty at Hunter as a lecturer, and I'm tenured as a lecturer. But I started a research path, and I went to graduate school. Now I'm taking classes at the Graduate Center. But also because I have a stable job, I'm a little bit in a privileged position than some of my other cohort members. So I have one question that you can sort of directly answer, but my second question is, the second point is that I will email you because we are doing a professionalization session on alt-act careers for the theater department, which is the program I'm in at the Graduate Center. So I'll email you, or one of our professors, Jean Graham Jones, she might email you. We would love for your input on that session. My second question is, I think there is a sense, so this summer, when COVID happened, I told myself that I will take my second exam and I will study for 3 months and I will get it done. And I did it. My cohort members, on the other hand, many who are not in the academic settings, feel like graduate education has to be so precious and so perfect, and you have to read all the books from cover to cover, that there's a sense of slowness, and I am very aware of that because I see them be that way, and I can only like push my cohort members so much without telling them that clock is ticking, your fellowship is going to run out after a certain point. But I think it also comes down from in a hierarchical manner, because there's this sense that you have to be so perfect, So I'm wondering if you want to like reflect on that or talk about that in any way.
Huge question for advising and mentorship too. I think that one of the best things that advisors can do is help people to move forward and to release some of those desires for perfection. Most grad students do not need pressure to feel like things need to be more perfect. I think people tend to put that on themselves anyway. And some of the best advising work I've seen has been work that really helps students to see the scope of what they're doing and not let it be everything. I heard a talk by a couple of publishers not too long ago. I'll have to look up who was speaking because I can't remember their names offhand, but one person in the audience asked, about the best way to advice for turning a dissertation into a book, basically. And the editor said that her recommendation would be to just let the dissertation be a dissertation. Don't write your dissertation trying to write a book. It's a dissertation, it's not everything. Finish it and move on, and then you can focus on the next thing. And I thought that was really good advice, because I see this a lot too, that there's this sense that each step is so fraught and carries so much weight on it that it becomes harder and harder and harder to actually take the step and move forward. I see some advisors not helping with that and making students second guess themselves on work that seems really strong. And I don't think that that's helpful. So I think that a lot of this could be better supported by advising that really acknowledges scope and encourages progress. I'm not sure that all does. Yeah, you don't finish your dis, you run out of time. But the best dissertation is a done dissertation. And it's so easy to say that from the other side. It doesn't feel that way when you're in it.
No, it's part of that imposter syndrome too. I think just feeling you'll never live up to that level of your advisors or the people that you admire in the field. Great questions and comments. We have a couple of minutes if we want to finish it off. Catherine has a comment here. Yeah, that's part of it too, isn't it? I mean, I assume there's competition in every discipline, but maybe more so. What do you?
There, you know, I mean, I think it's both caring about the students, caring about the work we do. There's a sense of really wanting to always put our best foot forward. And I do think that the competitive nature and I think a sense of scarcity contributes to that, you know, it's hard to get something published. And so when you have something out there, you need to make sure that it represents your thinking perfectly and that there's nothing you would want to state differently. It's, you know, I would love to find a way to shift towards a mindset of abundance and joy in higher education. I think that would really change the way that people approach their work. But again, that's a big cultural question. I see a lot of people are having to go. Thank you all so much for coming. I really appreciate it.
Let's do a virtual clapping for Katina. A lot of people have to run, but thank you so much, Katina. This is great. And we'll have the recording posted. I put the link to your today's article from the Chronicle. Thanks, Jennifer. Any final thoughts from Jeff or Katina? We saw Jeff's dog earlier.
Yeah, my dog made a cameo. You know, Katina, I would go for another hour. I thought it was fantastic. Yeah, the last thing I had on my mind, which if people feel like sticking around for a couple of minutes, I'd be curious to hear your response. It's sort of a not the main motif, but kind of a you know, contrapuntal motif or something in the book. The way that the sort of Ivy League and R1 schools set an agenda, set a tone, set a standard that the vast majority of institutions and especially students, you know, then sort of sit on the Procrustean bed that's created by, you know, the R1s and especially the kind of the Ivy League. In the New York Times, it's almost as if nothing but Harvard, Princeton, and Yale even exist in higher education. And so I just wonder if you have ideas about how we can sort of survive and thrive and how we might push back and kind of create our own standards, our own benchmarks. You know, it's sort of an impossible question, but, you know, I do think it's an existential position we find ourselves in that your work does speak to.
Really big question. And I don't know that I have an answer, but I think that it's the right question to be asking. How do we separate? I mean, I really, more and more, I think that public higher ed and elite private higher ed, they're just not doing the same thing, you know? And if there's a way to stop trying and to start really building structures that match our values, I just wonder how freeing that would be, what it would look like, and what it might make possible. I don't know what the right structures are, but I would like to continue thinking about it.
Great. Well,
101.
Sorry, but I didn't hear that, but.
Dig into it too deeply. It's a question that I'd love to continue thinking about.
Well, thanks again. I think this was great. I think we have a good, I'm going to stop the recording. And